And, good morning to everybody here. It's great to see you all. As Mark said, I'm going to be talking about RB209 and the update that's due out relatively soon. The talk is entitled What to Expect in the New Edition. Now, what I'm actually going to do is talk about the review and the recommendations that ADAS made as part of that review that was commissioned by AHDB. I can't guarantee exactly what is going to be in the new edition of the RB209 because that's still being drafted, as Mark said. But it will be a good indication of where things are going. So no doubt everybody will be familiar with this document. I like that Mark brought the original 1973 first edition. This was the 8th edition from 2010, and it was published by DEFRA based on data that was collected up to 2009. So you can see that we've had quite a few years of data that we need to add into there. It's been estimated that about £11 million has been spent on relevant research that could go into a new edition of RB209 since the 8th edition. That includes things on research on soil, on micronutrients, on nitrogen responses. So there was quite a lot of information that's been gathered since that last edition. So I said DEFRA funded that edition of the RB209, but now it's under the responsibility of AHDB to produce the new edition. So AHDB commissioned ADAS to carry out some research and a review of all the data, including new data, and make recommendations based on that review to feed into a new edition. And as Mark said, the new edition is due to be out soon. It's due to be out May next year. It's being drafted at the moment based on the findings of the ADAS review. I haven't got time to go through all the changes that might be being made in RB209. The review went from everything from the principles section right up to grassland and horticulture. I obviously haven't got time to talk about that, so I'm just going to talk about a few key changes that are going to be enabled in the arable crop section. And firstly, these changes will involve updating the nitrogen recommendation tables, the key tables that everybody uses to work out how much fertiliser to put on. And this has involved research and findings for wheat and barley and oilseed rape, but also more minor crops such as oats and triticale as well. There is proposed changes to adjust nitrogen recommended rates based on predicted yield. This is already in place for oilseed rape in the current 8th version of RB209, but we're looking to update this for winter wheat and also barley as well. There's going to be more detailed guidance on meeting malting barley quality specifications and also winter barley nitrogen timings and also winter oilseed rape nitrogen timings. Now I'm going to focus on the first two of those points in this talk and mention the last three as well. If anybody has further questions they want to ask me on more detailed parts of the review, then I'll be on the AHDB stand after this talk so we can talk about it then. So firstly, updating the nitrogen recommendation, the main N rate tables that everybody looks at. We had over 1,600 nitrogen response experiments, nitrogen response curves to look at as part of this review. And the first analysis we carried out was to look at the relationship between the actual optimum N rates we were finding in the research and the soil nitrogen supply. And then also we looked at the relationship with the current, what would be currently recommended in the 8th edition of RB209. So this is a winter wheat example. We did this for all crops, but this is just for winter wheat. We have four of the RB209 soil type here, and each point on the graphs are a nitrogen response curve, so a site by season by treatment combination for each of the soil types. The dotted lines are the actual relationship regression between the optimum N rate and the soil nitrogen supply, and the blue solid lines are the what would have been recommended in RB209 8th edition. So if you look at the bottom left graph, the medium and deep clay soil types, you can see that the RB209 current recommendations, I don't know if you can see that, I can't. The RB209 current recommendations are very closely related to actual optimum N rates for the different soil nitrogen supplies, which is great. So that means we don't necessarily have to update the recommendation tables for those types of soil. But on the top left, you can see the light sand soil. The line of the RB209 current recommended rates is lower than the actual relationship. So in that case, we would want to update the tables. I apologise, these slides are slightly wordy. I didn't want to put all the numbers with all the tables on because you would have spent all your time reading it. So I just put the main points of how these tables are likely to change, and then if anyone wants any more details, they can come and see me later. So for winter wheat, in the recommendation tables, there'll be small increases of about 20 kilos of nitrogen per hectare for light sandy soils and also silts for most SNS rates. In spring wheat, we actually had no data available to update these tables, so these won't be updated. It's something as part of the review, we've recommended certain areas that need further research, and spring wheat is one of those. In terms of winter barley, for winter feed barley, there's recommendations that there'll be small increases, 10 to 20 kilos of N per hectare, for light sands again, and silts for all SNS indices, and also shallow soils at SNS index of 0. And then winter malting barleys, this is a different case. There'll be small rises for sands, but reductions for a lot of the other soils for the recommendations. And this is because there was evidence to show that more reductions in N rates were needed for grain to be able to achieve the 1.8% nitrogen in the grain for malting. Moving on to spring barley, spring feed barley, again increases of about 20 to 30 kilos of N per hectare for light sands. And then with the malting barleys, it's a similar situation where most soils are looking at a reduction in recommended N rates to meet the malting barley specifications. Now, winter oats, rye and triticale, they're in the current version, they're in one table. Now, we've had some more data available since the 8th edition was published. In oats, there hasn't been a huge amount of nitrogen response experiments carried out, but those that have been carried out have shown that generally there's quite a big increase in nitrogen fertiliser required compared to what is the current maximum N recommended rate, which is 150 kilos of N per hectare. So oats nitrogen recommendations are going to be increased by 40 kilos per hectare across the board, all soil types, all SNS indices. Now, this comes with the caveat that if you're in a very high lodging situation, you might not want to do this. But we think that this 40 kilos is actually a conservative estimate, and actually if there's further research carried out, it may be that it might change again. With triticale, we've actually had quite a number of experiments carried out in triticale, and those experiments have found that there's no actual difference between the optimum N rate for triticale and wheat. So this means for the new edition of RB209, the triticale recommendations will be the same as wheat recommendations in the same tables. There are a number of conditions associated with triticale. We'd recommend that you reduce the rates by about 40 kilos per hectare if you've got high lodging risk situation. Also, because triticale is often traded at a discount to wheat, obviously the break-even ratio, the point at which it's economically worth applying more nitrogen, may well be lower for triticale than for wheat. So this should be taken into account as well. And also thinking about the yield adjustment factor, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, if your triticale is in a low input, low yielding type situation, then you may want to reduce nitrogen rates there as well. With rye, those recommendations are actually staying the same because we actually had, again, no data to be able to update those tables. So that's the nitrogen recommendation tables, and generally there are some changes happening there. But I'm now going to think about adjusting nitrogen rates for predicted yields. This is something we already do in oilseed rape, but we've looked at the data also for wheat and for barley now as well. And so we think, based on this data, that it is worth adjusting nitrogen rates depending on your yield. So I'll just show you an example of the sort of analysis we carried out on this data. This is for winter barley, and it shows the effects of yield on nitrogen requirement. So you can see the yield along the bottom and the nitrogen requirement along the side. So the nitrogen requirement it's a bit of a long equation, but it's the soil nitrogen supply plus the optimum N rate times 0.6, because that's generally assumed as the fertiliser uptake efficiency. So if you look at these data, each of the points are a site by season by treatment combination, so each is an N response curve. You can see that there's a significant positive relationship between yield and N requirement. So as yields are increasing, the N requirement gets higher. And this just shows an actual example of a winter barley trial at High Mothorpe in 2015. And this uses a number of different varieties of barley, and it has the nitrogen response curves, and in the black triangles, those are the economic optimum nitrogen rates. Now, if you superimpose onto this graph the nitrogen recommendations, which would be recommended for this trial at this site in this season, you can see that the recommendation would be exactly the same for all the varieties, and it isn't necessarily that close to what the economic optimum actually is. If you then adjust the N recommendations for yield, these are now on the grey dots on the graph, you can see that based on the yields of those varieties, you would get quite a range of nitrogen rates recommended, and you can see that they are actually closer to the optimum than was the current recommendations. So based on quite a lot of analysis, we've in the review we've recommended that nitrogen rates should be adjusted up or down by 20 kilos of N per hectare based on standard rates of 8 tonnes per hectare of winter wheat. So if you're going up or down, you increase or decrease by 20 kilos per hectare per tonne of yield, higher or lower than 8. In winter feed barley, the baseline is 6.5 tonnes per hectare, from which you would adjust up or down, and spring barley is 5.5 tonnes per hectare. Oilseed rape, as I said, already uses this adjustment, and this isn't changing. It's the same at 30 kilos a hectare per half tonne a hectare over 3.5 tonnes. Now these new recommendations bring RB209 into line with NVZ regulations as well. But it is worth saying that you really need to be confident of achieving these expected higher yields to actually adjust your N rates. So you really need several years of yield data from your mapping or weighbridge data or marketing data to understand that you are very likely to get these higher N rates, and so then you can be confident to adjust them. And another thing worth saying is that it's really important that other limiting factors that would limit yield need to be dealt with as far as possible. I know it's not always possible to deal with limiting factors, but dealt with as far as possible to be worth applying the nitrogen. Because if you've got poor soil structure or disease and weed problems, or haven't got enough supply of other major nutrients like P and K and S, you're never going to maximise your yield unless you optimise your other inputs. So those are the two major changes, the changes in the nitrogen recommended rates and the changes for yield adjustment. Just briefly, a few of the other changes that are happening in terms of malting barley. There'll be reductions in recommended N rates to meet the 1.8% N specifications for malting quality, and also further reduced if there are a lower grain N malting quality specifications. In terms of barley end timing, these have been adjusted, so they're now based on earlier timings. There's been quite a lot of research done that actually shows that barley yields are very dependent on getting good numbers of shoots per metre squared. So to do that, to maximise tillers and shoot number, you want to apply the nitrogen earlier. So the new recommendations will reflect that finding from the research. And in terms of the oilseed rape nitrogen timing, this is now moving to a more canopy managed timing regime, which is based on trying to achieve a green area index at mid-flowering of 3.5. And generally, the timings for canopy managed oilseed rape crops are slightly later. So the new recommendations will reflect those. So I think I've about run out of time. So thanks very much for your attention. And as I said, I'll be available on the AHDB stand between 1 and 3 this afternoon if anyone has any specific questions either on the arable section or on any of the other sections in the review. Thank you very much.